The relentless Arizona sun beat down on the small, dusty town of Haven Creek, a place where time seemed to move as slow as the wind across the plains. For Elara Vance, life had long settled into a predictable, solitary rhythm. At 35, her face bore the lines of a life lived outdoors. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were perpetually guarded. Her small cabin, built from sun-baked adobe, was her sanctuary, a place where she had found a hard-won peace with her fate. The town had labeled her the Old Maid of Vance's Patch, a title she accepted with a quiet, weary dignity. She had given up on dreams of a husband and children a decade ago, burying them alongside her parents' graves. Her only companions were the stubborn earth and the endless silent sky. It was on a sweltering Tuesday morning that the telegraph operator, a man named Bartholomew, who rarely smiled, rode up to her gate, the yellow paper clutched in his hand. Elara's heart, a thing she thought was made of stone, gave a strange, unsettling lurch. She signed for it, her hands calloused and steady. The words were a cold shock. Cousin Clara passed due to fever. Orphaned twins, Lila and Finn, await your care. Clara, a woman she had met only once at a family reunion, a face from a faded photograph. And now, two children she had never known were her responsibility. Her first instinct was a visceral, panicked refusal. She was a woman of meager means, her small farm producing barely enough to keep her from starvation. How could she possibly provide for two children? The notion was ludicrous. She paced the small cabin, the telegram a cursed thing in her hands. The faces of her town's gossips flashed in her mind, the scorn, the pity, the outright cruelty. A voice inside her screamed to ride away, to pretend she never received the message. Yet, as the hours ticked by, a different feeling began to take root. A half-remembered memory of Clara's gentle smile, the finality of the word orphaned, and the cold, stark reality that these two small souls had no one else. She saddled her tired mare, Patience, a creature as worn down by life as she was. She packed her satchel with the last of her dried beef, a small canteen of water, and a few coins. She had to see them, just to be sure. She rode north, the wind whipping dust into her face. The landscape was a blur of sun-baked earth and skeletal trees, but for the first time in years, Elara wasn't just observing the world. She was riding into it, toward a future she couldn't yet comprehend. The mining settlement of Redemption's Pass was a chaotic mess of temporary structures and temporary people. Life was measured in short, violent bursts of hope and long stretches of despair. Elara found the twins in a cramped, musty cabin. Lila, at 7, was a mirror of her deceased mother, her large brown eyes holding a sorrow that was bone deep. She sat with a quiet, unsettling stillness. Her younger brother Finn, a boy of 5, was a whirlwind of nervous energy, his small fists clenched, his face smudged with dirt. Elara's voice was a low, unpracticed whisper. "I'm Elara, your cousin." Lila's gaze was direct, piercing Elara's carefully constructed defenses. "Are you taking us to an orphanage?" The question was a reedy whisper, heavy with the weight of past betrayals. The word orphanage hung in the air, a cold, desolate term. Elara's throat tightened. The town orphanage was a known place of cruelty and neglect. "No," she said, surprising herself. "You're coming home with me." The long journey back was a silent, grueling ordeal. The twins were two small islands of grief in a sea of nothingness. Elara spoke little, unsure of what to say, and focused on the path ahead. When they finally arrived at her small homestead, the children looked at it with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The place was nothing like the bustling, temporary settlements they were used to. It was silent, vast, and achingly lonely. The first few days were a study in silent cohabitation. Elara, awkward with her newfound role, tried to establish a routine. She showed them how to feed the chickens, how to pump water from the well, how to sit quietly as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and pink. Finn, despite his initial bravado, was a quiet, watchful child. He followed Elara around, his small hand often reaching out to touch her skirt, as if to confirm her presence. Lila, however, was a force of nature. She began cleaning, organizing, and even attempting to cook the few ingredients Elara had. Her small hands were efficient, her mind sharp. She was a miniature matriarch, her mother's legacy in action. One evening, as Elara was mending a torn dress by the light of a flickering oil lamp, Lila approached her, her eyes full of a fierce, desperate hope. "Are we staying?" she asked, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Truly staying?" Elara looked up, met the girl's gaze, and saw her own vulnerability reflected back. "Yes," she said, her voice soft. "This is your home now." A hesitant, fragile smile touched Lila's lips. Finn, who had been listening from the corner, suddenly launched himself at Elara, wrapping his small arms around her leg in a tight, surprising hug. Elara's hands froze, the needle still in the air. A feeling she hadn't known since she was a girl, a sense of being needed, of being truly seen, flowed through her, warm and foreign. The news of Elara's new family spread like wildfire through Haven Creek. The postmaster, the general store owner, the women who congregated at the church, they all had something to say. The whispers were not kind. "She can't possibly afford them," one woman scoffed at the general store, her voice dripping with disdain. "She can barely afford herself." "What does a woman like her know about raising children?" another added, a self-appointed expert on motherhood. The town's judgment was a heavy blanket, suffocating and cruel. Elara felt it every time she went to the general store. The cashier's eyes held a mixture of pity and suspicion. The other women in line would whisper behind their hands. She held her head high, but the words chipped away at her resolve. She was no longer just the old maid. She was the woman who had taken on a burden she couldn't possibly handle. One day, as she was leaving the general store, a man named Silas Thorne approached her. He was a weathered rancher, his face etched with the lines of a hard but honest life. His eyes, the color of a summer sky, were kind and steady. Silas had been a friend of her father's, and his support was a lifeline. "Don't you pay them no mind, Elara," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "They talk because they don't understand. You're doing a good thing, a truly good thing." His words were a balm, a small act of kindness in a world that felt increasingly hostile. But the whispers intensified. A local merchant, Jedediah Stone, a man known for his greed and his cruelty, saw an opportunity. He had long coveted Elara's small plot of land, its proximity to the creek, making it a valuable asset. He began to spread rumors that Elara was unfit to raise the children, that she was a burden on the town and a neglectful guardian. He saw the children not as human beings, but as leverage. Jedediah Stone's campaign was subtle but relentless. He spoke to the sheriff, a man named Harris, who was more interested in keeping the peace than in justice. He spoke to the church elders, painting a picture of a woman on the verge of destitution, a woman whose home was no place for two innocent children. Elara, preoccupied with the daily struggles of their new life, was initially unaware of the threat. She was too busy trying to stretch their meager food supply, too busy mending torn clothes, and too busy learning how to be a mother. One afternoon, as she and the children were tending to the chickens, a heavy-set man on horseback rode up to the fence. It was Jedediah Stone, his face a mask of false concern. He dismounted, his boots kicking up dust as he approached the fence. "Heard you're having a time of it, Elara," he said, his gaze lingering on her fields. The town's worried about the children. They're delicate flowers after all. A woman alone. It's a heavy burden, 2 mouths to feed. I've been thinking, that plot of land of yours, it's a good piece. I'd be willing to take it off your hands for a fair price. It would give you a little nest egg to get by, and the children, well, the town would make sure they find a proper home. The implication was clear. He wanted her land, and he was using the children as a weapon. Elara's quiet resolve hardened into something fierce and unyielding. She moved to stand in front of Lila and Finn, her body a shield. My parents worked this land, Mr. Stone. My grandparents before them. It's not for sale. And the children, they are home. Stone's smile was a thin, cruel line. We'll see about that, Elara. The town has its ways. The courts have their ways. His words hung in the air long after he rode away, a dark omen of the battles to come. Elara knew then that her fight was not just against poverty, but against a powerful, malevolent force. The children were not just a blessing, they were a battlefield, and she was ready for war. The conflict with Jedediah Stone forced Elara to confront the town's social dynamics head-on. She was no longer just the reclusive spinster. She was a woman fighting for her family, and her struggle became a point of contention within the community. Some, like Silas Thorne, openly supported her, speaking out against Stone's predatory behavior. Others, however, either feared Stone or were swayed by his gossip. The church, a place that should have offered solace, became a source of tension. On Sunday, after the service, a group of women cornered Elara outside the church. "Are you sure you're doing the right thing, dear?" one asked, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "Those children deserve a real family, with a father and a stable home." Elara's voice was firm, though her hands trembled slightly. "A home is made of love, not just things. My parents taught me that, and these children have my love." It was an open declaration of war. That evening, as the sun set, Silas Thorne came to her home. He didn't speak of the town's gossip. Instead, he brought sacks of flour and sugar, a ham, and a new dress for Lila. He simply placed them on the table, his presence a quiet, steadfast source of support. "We all need help sometimes, Elara," he said, his gaze as steady as the Arizona mountains. "Don't let pride stand in the way of what's right." His gesture was a turning point. It wasn't just a donation. It was a symbol of alliance. He saw her not as a problem, but as a person, and he was offering a hand, not a handout. The children, sensing the tension, had been quiet. But now, as Silas left, Finn went to the flour sack and ran his small hand over it, as if to confirm its reality. Lila looked at Elara, her eyes full of understanding. They were not alone. The support of a single good person had begun to tip the scales against the judgment of many. Life on the homestead began to settle into a new, difficult routine. Elara taught the children how to garden, how to tell which plants were weeds and which were sustenance. Lila, with her natural intelligence, soaked up the knowledge like a sponge. Finn, ever the restless one, found his calling in the barn, caring for the chickens and the mule with a gentle touch that belied his nervous energy. One morning, the mule, their only means of transportation, fell ill. Its breath was labored, its movements sluggish. The children, who had grown fond of the old animal, were terrified. Elara knew the mule was their only hope for surviving the coming winter. Without it, they couldn't haul supplies from town or work the fields efficiently. Elara's heart sank. She didn't have the money for a veterinarian, and her knowledge of animal care was limited. She watched the animal suffer, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She felt the familiar pull of her old isolation, the instinct to handle everything herself. As the mule's condition worsened, Lila approached her, her face pale. "Can't we ask for help?" she whispered, her voice small but firm. "Silas, he knows about animals." The words were a bitter pill for Elara, a woman who had spent her life relying on no one but herself. But she looked at the children, their faces a mixture of fear and trust, and she knew she had to. She rode to Silas Thorne's ranch, her pride swallowed by her desperation. Silas didn't hesitate. He came with a bottle of a strong herbal remedy and a practiced hand. He spent hours with the mule, talking to it in a low, soothing voice. The children watched, their faces a mix of hope and anxiety. As the mule's breathing began to even out, a wave of relief washed over them all. The experience was a profound lesson in trust for Elara. She had always believed that asking for help was a sign of weakness. Now, she saw it as a sign of strength, a recognition that they were a family, and families leaned on each other. The old wounds of isolation were beginning to heal, replaced by the fragile but powerful bonds of community and care. Jedediah Stone, seeing that his whisper campaign was failing, decided to escalate. He approached the local judge, a man he had in his pocket, with a formal petition. He claimed Elara was neglecting the children, that she was a spinster of no means, and that the twins should be placed in the town orphanage where they could be properly cared for. The court date was set for 2 weeks' time. The news hit Elara like a physical blow. Her stomach churned with a mixture of fear and fury. Stone wasn't just after her land anymore. He was after her family. The children, sensing her anxiety, became withdrawn. Leela, ever the observer, noticed the way Elara's hands shook when she held a cup of tea. Finn stopped playing, his usual nervous energy replaced by a quiet stillness. Silas Thorne was the first to offer help. He brought the town's most respected lawyer, a man named Gideon Hayes, who had a reputation for fairness and a deep dislike of Jedediah Stone. Hayes listened patiently to Elara's story, his gaze sharp and intelligent. "We have to prove you're a fit mother, Elara," he said, "not just by your actions, but by the community's support." Elara's mind reeled. Community support? The very people who had been whispering about her for months? The task seemed impossible, but she knew she had to try. She and the children began to reach out to the few people who had shown them kindness, the kind-hearted woman at the general store, the old blacksmith, the families who had offered small gestures of help. They spoke of the home they had built, the love that had grown between them. The townspeople who had been on the fence began to see the truth. This was not a story of a woman in over her head. It was a story of a family being forged in fire. The courtroom was a small, stuffy room in the town hall. Jedediah Stone sat smugly at a table, his face a mask of false piety. He had his own witnesses, people he had either paid off or intimidated. Elara sat opposite him, her back ramrod straight, the children on a bench behind her, their hands intertwined. Jedediah's lawyer presented a case based on rumor and insinuation, painting Elara as a desperate, unfit woman. Witnesses, paid or intimidated, spoke of her poverty, her lack of a husband, her solitary past. Elara's heart sank with each damning word. It felt like her entire life was being used against her. Then Gideon Hayes began his defense. He called Silas Thorne to the stand. Silas, his voice a steady, powerful force, spoke of Elara's strength, her resilience, and the transformation he had witnessed in her. "She didn't ask for those children," he said, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. "They were placed in her care, and in return, she gave them a home filled with love and hard work. I've never seen 2 children so cared for." He called other witnesses, the people who had offered small kindnesses. The general store owner spoke of the children's politeness and their well-kept clothes. The blacksmith spoke of Elara's tireless work ethic. The witnesses were not wealthy or powerful. They were the heart of the town, people who had seen the truth with their own eyes. Then Hayes made a move that stunned the courtroom. He called Lila Vance to the stand. Lila, small and grave, walked to the front of the room. The judge, a stoic man with a weary face, asked her, "Do you want to live with this woman, Lila?" Lila looked at Elara, a fierce, protective love in her eyes. "She's not just a woman," Lila said, her voice clear and strong. "She's my mother." The word mother hung in the air, a powerful, undeniable truth that no amount of gossip or legal maneuvering could erase. The bond between them was real. The judge, a man who had seen his share of deceit and injustice, looked at Lila's unshakable resolve, then at Elara's face, etched with love and fear. He looked at the witnesses, the faces of common people standing up for what was right. He looked at Jedediah Stone, his smug expression beginning to crumble, replaced by a cold, impotent fury. "Case dismissed," the judge said, his voice quiet but firm. "I find no evidence of neglect. The children will remain in the care of Ms. Elara Vance. And Mr. Stone," he added, his gaze a sharp command, "I suggest you leave this family be." A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Elara, her legs weak, felt Finn's small hand slip into hers. Jedediah Stone rose, his face a mask of impotent rage, and stormed out. Elara didn't watch him go. She was focused on Lila, who was running to her, a triumphant smile on her face. As they left the courthouse, the town was a different place. The whispers had been replaced by a quiet sense of respect. People nodded to her, some offering shy smiles. The postmaster, Bartholomew, tipped his hat. "Good job, Elara," he said, his face softening for the first time she could remember. The battle had been won, not just for them, but for the soul of the community. They had chosen love and decency over greed and malice. The town had been reminded of its own better nature, and Elara had been a part of that. Months passed, and the homestead thrived. Elara, no longer a solitary figure, found herself surrounded by life. The fields, tended with the help of the children, yielded a bountiful harvest. The cabin, once a place of quiet solitude, was now filled with the sound of laughter and the comforting chaos of a family. The smells of baking bread and stew filled the air. Lila learned to sew and cook with a skill far beyond her years, and Finn, with Silas's help, became a natural with the animals. Silas Thorne became a constant presence, not just as a friend, but as something more. He brought firewood and helped with repairs, his presence a quiet, comforting support. He didn't speak of love or marriage, but it was in the way he looked at Elara, in the way he joked with the children, in the way he treated them as if they were already his own. Elara, her heart no longer a guarded fortress, began to let him in. She saw in him not just a man, but a partner. A man who saw her for who she truly was, a woman of quiet strength and a deep capacity for love. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars pepper the vast Arizona sky, Silas spoke. "You once said a home is made of love, Elara." "I did," she said, her voice soft. "You built one out of dust and defiance," he said, his hand resting gently on hers. He looked at her, his eyes full of a profound admiration. "And you weren't certain anyone would marry you, but you were wrong." He didn't ask her to be his wife, not directly. He simply made a statement, a gentle, powerful declaration of his intention. "You were wrong." Elara looked at him, then at the children sleeping peacefully inside the cabin. She looked at the life she had fought so hard to build, and she saw it not as a consolation prize, but as the truest blessing she had ever known. She had not found a husband because she had a family. She had a family because she had first found herself. And as she looked at Silas, at the stars, and at the home that had blossomed from her loneliness, she knew she had never been more certain of anything in her life. The horizon was no longer a symbol of her solitude, but a promise of all that was yet to come. The old maid of the town had found her family, and in doing so, had found her life.